I am Fay Yarbrough. I'm an associate dean in the School of Humanities, and I'm also an associate professor in the Department of History. And I'm welcoming all of you to attend this Humanities Now event with Dr. Travis Alexander. Dr. Alexander is a postdoctoral fellow in the Rice Academy, and he's presenting our very last Humanities Now conversation today. And just so you know what these conversations have been about, it's been a real effort on the part of the School of Humanities to demonstrate how the disciplines that we study, the questions that we ask, really touch upon the issues that we're all facing today. And I think Dr. Alexander's presentation is really going to bring that home for us. We are going to continue to have these next semester, next year. So please be on the lookout for announcements about our speakers next year. And if you have suggestions of speakers you'd like me to invite, please feel free to email me and let me know. I want to make a few announcements about upcoming events in the School of Humanities. On April 9th, the Center for African and African American Studies is having an event entitled From Literary Pan-Africanism to Black Cultural Mythology. On April 13th at 4 p.m., Politics, Law, and Social Thought will have an event entitled How Should We Decide Who Deserves Public Honor and Memorialization in Statues? And I want to point out that if you are taken by the topics that Dr. Alexander discusses today, he will be teaching a session, a summer class during the summer session. And you are welcome to sign up and get more of Dr. Alexander this summer. Okay, and without further ado, I will turn things over to our speaker today, Travis Alexander. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Okay, I'm not muted. Yeah, thanks, Faye, for putting this together, and also Kathleen, who I think is not here yet, but I know she had a hand in this as well. And for thinking to include me in this series, which sounds really cool. So I'm excited to share some of my work with you guys today. My own writing of late has focused primarily on literary responses to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But in some ways, this topic is just a condensation of my broader interest in the changing relationship among health, race, sexuality, and activism across US history. I brought these subjects together last semester in an undergraduate course called Plague and Protest, Identity, Activism, and Disease in Literature and Film. I conceived and pitched the course as something like a genealogy of the present, a prehistory for this moment in US history, this time of mass protest against the immiseration of Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, undocumented, and trans life, whether through hyperbolic police power, the pulmonary assault of COVID, or other asymmetrically born maladies constituting our medical apartheid. Another and perhaps more modest way to put this is that recent history had set this course up to succeed. Oh, I gotta share my screen. I gotta do the PowerPoint. I've already screwed this up. Here, I'm gonna do a share screen real quick. I was talking to Faye about setting this up so that you don't have to see my email and text coming in. 1 second. Okay. Now, one version of this talk, and maybe the most intuitive one, indeed the one teased by my title slide here, would look primarily at the historical antecedents of resistance to the pathologization of race and queer bodies. And my course itself accomplished just that through the examination of texts like Amiri Baraka's play The Slave, Sapphire's experimental novel Push, and Jordan Peele's social thriller Get Out, among other texts. But what I think might be more fruitful for our purposes today, or at least more counterintuitive, is to consider this triangulation of terms, race, queerness, and health, on the other side of this nation's bitter color line. Okay, so why is it not? There we go. I want, that is, to consider how systems of domination and control have since the late 19th century been stabilized by the yoking of heterosexual whiteness to normative conceptions of healthy embodiment. I want to show how health itself has been abidingly produced as white and straight. In what follows, then, I turn to fiction and film to demonstrate the uncanny uniformity of this trope across the last 130 years by posing three texts as an unlikely trilogy: Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper, and the paired 1999 blockbusters of Fight Club and The Matrix. In different ways, all of these texts engage in an almost compulsive attempt to attach, or as the case may be, reattach heterosexual whiteness to health by depicting racially and sexually marked bodies as inherently diseased, indeed, as an ontological threat to communal public health. It's a threat, these texts believe, that must be liquidated, whether physically, psychically, or representationally. It's just not letting me do it with the click arrow. In this way, then, the phobic energy of Gilman's, Fincher's, and the Wachowskis' weirdly similar texts allow us to see how protest is recurringly linked to plague on both sides of the color line. They show, that is, how whiteness has been just as invested in protesting and resisting perceived threats to the health of its racial position as organizations like Black Lives Matter. An orientation towards the project of racial justice today and toward the rectification of racial and sexual health disparities more specifically would do well to understand the genealogy, shape, and dynamism of these fearful white nationalist theorizations of health and resistance, if only because they are currently experiencing an outsized resurgence. So, another prehistory of the present. I've selected these three texts today not only because they constellate these concepts I'm interested in, nor just because they were student favorites, although I do have some alums from the class and you can take this up with them in the Q&A. I've selected them instead because they each contribute a unique conceptual armature, what we might call a cognitive map of white supremacy's phantasmatic conjuration of health in the present. Gilman's text, for instance, will be seen to offer us a perspective upon the uncomfortable traffic among rhetorics of feminism, mental health, and white supremacy. And meanwhile, though The Matrix and Fight Club share a release date, 1999, and an investment in the same triangulation of terms, they pursue markedly divergent tactics. Where Fight Club looks back, while it remains invested in a 20th century discourse unable to imagine the securitization of white health except through a projective ascription of disease to race and queer bodies, The Matrix instead points toward our present. It imagines, that's to say, a co-optation of virality on behalf of whiteness, an identification of potentials for racial domination in the representational economy of disease itself, a life for whiteness from death. By way of an envoi, I'll attempt to configure the Wachowskis' film as anticipating contemporary valorizations of virality, as in going viral, and the ethos of compulsive entrepreneurship and flexibility encoded by the latter, as well as what they might mean for a time of COVID, or as we might hope, a time post-COVID. I hope in what follows to share the pleasure of some of the close readings my students produced in my seminar. In fact, I'll have occasion periodically to speak to the power of both literary analysis as such, and more precisely, the deconstructive, psychoanalytic, historical, and formal exegesis I hope to confer to students in all the classes I teach. Powers that I would say right now are invaluable. So with that roadmap in mind, let's take a look at The Yellow Wallpaper. Gilman's perhaps over-anthologized story, based on her own treatment by the early American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, is the tale of an unnamed woman experiencing symptoms of what her physician husband John diagnoses as hysteria. John thus prescribes his wife the rest cure, which she's to take in seclusion from an upstairs nursery in, quote, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, a haunted house that makes her think of English places you read about. The, quote, queer quietude of this estate will be the woman's cure. Soon, however, she becomes tormented by the sprawling and flamboyant wallpaper. Quote, it is dull enough to confuse the eye and following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradiction. The color is repellent, almost revolting. A smoldering, unclean yellow, she writes. The pattern, moreover, quote, here we go. I keep forgetting to do the click thing. The pattern, she notes, moreover, quote, lolls like a broken neck on two bulbous eyes, staring at you upside down. The narrator observes the, quote, impertinence of its figures, up and down and sideways they crawl, and those absurd, unblinking eyes are everywhere. I never saw so much expression in an inanimate thing. As the wallpaper maddens her, the narrator takes comfort solely from the thought of the baby being cared for by the nurse, a baby who therefore, quote, does not have to occupy this nursery with the horrid wallpaper, and who can roam free amid the picturesquely Gothic manor outside her window, full of, quote, riotous old-fashioned flowers and gnarly trees. Yet even the manor's vegetation soon fails to comfort her. Eventually, a figure emerges from within an equally, quote, pointless sub-pattern in the paper, a, quote, strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design, a design, quote, not arranged on any laws of radiation or alternation or repetition or symmetry or anything else I have ever heard of. The pattern is such a, quote, defiance of law as to be a constant irritant to the normal mind. Just when she's nearly, quote, mastered it, the wallpaper slaps you in the face, knocks you down, and tramples you. The wallpaper even begins to exceed its physical form. It stained everything it touched, she writes, leaving, quote, yellow smooches on all her clothes. And the smell, it creeps all over the house and gets into her hair. What is this smell? Why, a yellow smell, of course. Noticing that his wife is not improving, indeed that she's getting worse, John himself has become to the narrator, quote, queer. He enlists the narrator's nurse to aid his wife. This nurse, however, quote, wanted to sleep with me, the sly thing, but I told her I should undoubtedly rest better for a night all alone. The tipping point of our narrator's descent into madness is her discovery that the hidden figure is a woman indeed who must be rescued, who is trapped in the wallpaper crying out for help. Our narrator, quote, wonders if this woman will come out of the wallpaper as I did. Yet upon this identification with the trapped woman in the paper, something strange happens. The narrator no longer wants to escape the wallpaper, but rather to stay within it. Quote, I don't want to go outside, she notes at the end, for outside everything is green instead of yellow. Inside, she can, quote, creep smoothly along the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch around the wall. At the story's climactic ending, John discovers her creeping on the floor and faints. Hang on, I'm gonna let my dog in here with me and maybe he'll calm down. The pleasures of teaching at home. Okay. So here it's the relation between race and health that's more apparent than that between sexuality and health. It likely doesn't take a semiotician to discern the robust Asian coding of the wallpaper. And indeed, a long tradition of critics have spilled smooches of their own ink, attending to the racial predicates of a, quote, unclean yellow pattern, at once dull and flamboyant. That hearkening forward towards voyeuristic Orientalist anthropology, quote, provokes study. A pattern whose impertinent, bulbous eyes crawl sideways on a lolling neck, a pattern that sprawls and tramples, that smells and stains. Almost to a word, Gilman's description transcribes the horror of whites observing Chinese American society emerging on the West Coast. And Gilman herself was living in California when she wrote the story, just a few years after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The menacingly Asian character of the wallpaper is counterposed with the charming and reassuring English flavor of the estate. Though its gardens are, quote, riotous, this characteristic nonetheless remains ineffably distinct from the wallpaper's, quote, impertinence and defiance of law. Its defiance of alternation and symmetry, failures for which she faults the wallpaper but lauds the trees on the estate. The riotous and gnarly vegetation, of course, can be redeemed insofar as, evoking Englishness, they confer our narrator the comforting visual enclosure of whiteness itself. On the one hand, then, the odorous, dripping, lolling, bulbous, and lawless nature of the wallpaper alone casts the raced body as a threat to the health and hygiene of whiteness, encroaching on the latter even in its airy of a British romance both isolated and belated. And our narrator's escalating madness might well be construed as a kind of reactionary white protest against the perceived plague of race. This dynamic is replicated with a crucial difference through conjoined discourses of reproduction and sexuality in the story. On the one hand, our fearful and fruitful Karen of a narrator has already proven herself a viable vessel for the reproduction of whiteness and takes solace from the idea that her young daughter is kept away from the racial taint of her room. On the other, she's constantly beset by the threatened return of a queerness she is everywhere at pains to repress. I lost my place there. What's curious is that this queerness emerges not from the wallpaper, but from her nurse and her husband, that this call comes from inside the house. After all, the sly nurse wants to sleep with her, and the erstwhile stoic John falls victim to a queerly feminine fainting spell at the story's conclusion. So if white health, here literalized and figured as white reproductive efficacy, is perceived as under threat, a fear for that matter that has achieved extensive play in contemporary white nationalist discourses of so-called race suicide, it doesn't seem to be from a diseased Asianness, but instead from a decadent and therefore impotent whiteness itself. This juncture, in fact, is where we can begin to make sense of the narrator's mysterious identification with the Chinese woman in the wallpaper. Central to anti-Chinese discourses around the time of the story's composition were allegations that Chinese people, much like rhetorics surrounding Black masculinity in the same era, and of course continuing into the present as well, were animalistically sexual and fecund, hence their sprawling population numbers. Our narrator's desire to escape the green of the manor into the yellow of the wallpaper at the end of the story, then, must be understood as an attempt to escape the sterile, non-reproductive queerness of the English Gothic for the virile potency of the multitudinous Asian menace. This, then, is the true, quote, sub-pattern of the story, and marks its vexed attempt, indeed marks its failure, to successfully triangulate whiteness, health, and heterosexuality. Put differently, in its assent to racist rhetorics which abjected the Chinese as diseased and animalistic, the yellow wallpaper must unwittingly establish that same population as the only viable emblem of a functioning heterosexual reproductivity. Its failure, of course, can be our cognitive map now. If the attempted triangulation of whiteness, health, and vigorous resistance or protest remains semi-transparent in Gilman's polemic, it's certainly been more completely submerged by the time of Fight Club. Indeed, in my course, I taught Fincher's film first, hoping for our discussion of it to do double duty, not just as a thematic or tropic investigation, but also as a clinic on the avowedly paranoid hermeneutic of suspicion I like to teach. Fight Club is putatively the story of Jack, played by Edward Norton Jr., a lowly salaryman toiling away in a lifeless corporation. Jack's only joys come from decorating his nest with the cruel optimisms and deferrals of IKEA furniture. Then he meets Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. His opposite in every way, Tyler lives on the fringes of society, spurning its rules and etiquette. Tyler survives by selling soap made from the rendered fat thrown out by cosmetic surgeons and lives with the sultry Marla, played by Helena Bonham Carter. He teaches Norton's character the therapeutic power of physical violence, a brutality artificially suppressed and sublimated in Jack's queer world. They start a fight club that grants life, healing, and power to scores of involuntary beta males like Jack. Eventually, the Fight Club radicalizes into a terror network that intends to blow up a skyscraper in the Gotham-esque city where the film is set. So where am I going with this? The film appears to have nothing to do with race or health, and only tangentially to do with sexuality and protest. The manifest thesis of the film is that Jack must become more masculine, and that Tyler helps him to accomplish this. Yet Fight Club is everywhere unable to imagine that which is insufficiently masculine, except through troping it as queer. The film instantiates this relay in its very first shot of Jack, where a gun, held will later learn by Tyler, is thrust into his mouth. Fincher's camera thus introduces Jack at the scene of his forced homosexualization by the film's presiding symbolic conjunction of true masculinity and violence, the phallic pistol. The first scene set in Jack's office, meanwhile, opens on a close-up of our protagonist's boss's tie, panning up to his face. The particular accessory in question, Norton intones in voiceover, is his boss's coveted, quote, cornflower blue tie. Not only is the masculinity of the necktie a Trumpian attempt at phallic authority, feminized at its very origin by its wearer's womanly designation of the particular hue in question, it's not simply a blue tie, that is. But in the same shot, moreover, Jack prophesies that his supervisor would likely enjoy a, quote, latte enema. I'll leave it to another paper to relate this latte phobia to the Starbucks green gel suffusing all of the film's principal photography. And yet, if this man is not really a man, Jack must be even less of one, being his subordinate. Indeed, when the camera follows Jack moments later into a cancer support meeting, he puts on a name tag identifying himself falsely as Cornelius. At the beginning of the film, Norton's voiceover gives vent to a millenarian angst that everything is now, quote, a copy of a copy of a copy. Yet here it's Jack himself who, in adopting the name Cornelius and thereby evoking his boss's cornflower tie, becomes a copy of an obliterated but originary BME, big masculine energy. During the support session, in fact, the group leader will offer Jack something of an enema in his own right, encouraging Cornelius to, quote, step through the back door into his own personal cave, there to discover his power animal. As if the point were not sufficiently clear, Marla, who Jack meets at this meeting, discovers that our protagonist is at the meeting on false pretenses, not a cancer survivor at all, but a copy of one. Quote, trying to slip it by me, she asks him, once again playing on his inability to realize the penetrative male role. In fact, in her first line spoken in the film, Marla asks Jack upon walking into the meeting, quote, this is cancer, right? Naming not just the topic of the meeting, Marla here deems the entire queer edifice of support malignant. If it seems like I'm off on a tangent here, I'll ask you to hang in with me for a bit more. Most readings of the film insist that Durden's role is to train Jack out of the queerness that society has imposed on him. He teaches Jack how to fight, toughens him up, weans him off of the support groups whose enervating proliferation of help is, so the film will entertain, society's real cancer. But alongside, or rather beneath this masculinity, Fincher's camera intuits in Tyler himself a strange femininity, even a homoeroticism in its own right. Tyler's part-time job is as a projectionist at a movie theater, where he delights in splicing shots of what we'll call large black male organs into his films. He also eventually tries to rid the house of Marla and those like her. Quote, I don't know if more women is what we need, he tells Jack. Quote, most of the week we were Ozzie and Harriet, observes Norton's voiceover. Likewise, Durden reveals to Jack that he simply, quote, can't get married. I'm like a 30-year-old boy, iterating familiar cultural tropes about the suspended development and primary narcissism of male homosexuality. And if this latter-day Ozzie and Harriet do fill the house with young ones, here the latter take the form of hard young men more interested in ending the world than continuing it, iterating what queer theorist Lee Edelman celebrates as no future, a farce on the notion of childbirth. And when Marla discovers Jack having been beaten to a pulp by Tyler later in the film, she asks, quote, who did this, a guy or a girl? The publicity campaign surrounding the film seems to have tapped into this vein of liminality, with Mark Seliger's now famous shoot for Rolling Stone depicting Brad Pitt in a number of dresses. True heterosexual masculinity, that's to say, seems to have slipped Tyler by as well. As a guru for Jack, then, Tyler reveals but does not embody the narrowly calibrated and disciplinary domain for acceptable heterosexual masculinity. Something of a postmodern Zarathustra, Tyler succeeds as a teacher in being disowned by his pupil. And succeed he does. Jack stops shy of Tyler's hyperbolic and even homoerotic masculinity, but retains a zeal of violent heterosexual prowess. Quote, I felt like putting a bullet through the head of every panda who wouldn't screw to save its own species, he declaims at the end of the film, correcting the farce of reproduction iterated by the proliferation of hunky young men who fill the home he shares with Durden. So Fight Club yokes heterosexuality to reproductive vitality and through it to health itself, but it can't slip its own binarism into the film without a kind of representational insurance mechanism. It can't envision this successful heterosexuality, that is, without casting it as necessarily also white. And here's where I'm going to offer a less intuitive thesis, namely that Brad Pitt's Tyler is, well, Black. Not phenotypically, perhaps, nor in any ontological sense at all for that matter. But he does inarguably magnetize a superabundance of stereotypical Black signifiers. He lives in a bad part of town, engages in violent crime, dresses like a pimp, and in the case of his projectionist pleasures, enacts his own sadistic will upon bourgeois culture through a punitive identification with the Black phallus. Fight Club thus conjoins Pitt's impermissibly homoerotic and therefore sick masculinity to Blackness, casting the two as sides of the same pathogenic coin. It's through this yoking that Fincher's film provides its audience with a disciplinary and pedagogical triangulation of whiteness, heterosexuality, and health, envisioning, moreover, the necessity of violent resistance to realize and maintain it. Its future very much seems like our present. As with Fight Club, so too will some interpretive pressure be required to recover the logic of race, health, and sexuality in the Wachowski sisters' cyberpunk masterpiece, The Matrix, released the same year. Set in a dystopian future, the film focuses on a man named Thomas Anderson, a computer hacker going by Neo, and played with a woodenness that can only be called majestic by the inimitable Keanu Reeves. Anderson begins to receive messages through his computer from a user called Morpheus. And I'll say here, I can't resist a bit of potentially unilluminating trivia that the Wachowskis went to Reeves only after Pitt turned them down to do Fight Club. Federal agents, meanwhile, have discovered this correspondence and want to interrogate Neo about it. Neo is rescued by Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, and his team of outlaws, led primarily by a woman named Trinity, played by Carrie-Anne Moss. They famously give Neo the choice of the two pills. Take the blue pill and be returned to life as usual. Take the red pill and learn the truth. Neo obviously elects the red pill and learns from Morpheus that he and everyone else have been, quote, sleeping, that they are really living in a simulation of real life. Real human bodies are kept in vats where their bioelectric energy is harvested to sustain the intelligent machines who launched a successful uprising early in the 21st century. And now it's the humans who are the true slaves. Their mission, a calling for which Neo has been deemed by an oracle, quote, the one, is to unplug humans from this simulacrum to set them free. Meanwhile, Morpheus, Neo, and their team are hunted by an army of identical agents Smith, who work on behalf of the Matrix to maintain the delicate order of the machines. At a point, the agents capture Morpheus, who must be rescued by Trinity and Neo. They successfully free Morpheus, but not before the agent Smith can fatally shoot Neo. Trinity whispers in his dying ear that he must not really be dead, as the oracle prophesied to her that she would end up with the one. She then revives Neo with a chaste kiss that nonetheless augurs an army of rebel babies to come. This heterofuturist intimacy imbues Neo with the final burst of power needed to manipulate the Matrix one last time. At the finale, Neo hacks back in and sounds his barbaric Whitmanian yawp, sending a message to the machines that he'll lead the rebellion against them, that he'll show their prisoners a world where, quote, anything is possible, a world, quote, without control or boundaries. So I've asked this before. What could this possibly have to tell us about race, health, sexuality, and protest? An attempt to truly extract the film's overdetermined signifiers, any attempt, rather, to truly extract from the film's overdetermined signifiers a story like those of Gilman and Fincher must first reckon with the film's manifest message, which seems pretty progressive. After all, the film celebrates a diverse team of insurgents led by Morpheus and the Oracle, both Black and the racially ambiguous Reeves, who band together against the sickly white ubiquity of the agent Smith, face of police power, in defiance of a digital apparatus sapping human vitality in exchange for mere simulacral pleasure. This can't help but evoke contemporary resistances to social media as a destabilizer of multiracial democracy around the world today. Never mind the fact that the film preceded the creation of Facebook by over half a decade. echoing not only the racism of white supremacist culture generally, but white supremacist policing specifically. Agent Smith tells Morpheus, quote, "You all look the same to me," referring either to Black people, resistance fighters, or possibly the latter as a displacement of the former. And indeed, perhaps nothing in the film holds out a more tantalizing convergence with anticipatory wokeness than the most famous monologue in the film, when Agent Smith extols, quote, "our civilization of machines." Referring to the Matrix, Smith says, "I'm going to be honest with you. I hate this place, this zoo, this prison, this reality, whatever you want to call it. I can't stand it any longer. It's the smell, if there is such a thing. I feel saturated by it. I can taste your stink, and every time I do, I fear that I have somehow been infected by it. It's repulsive, isn't it? I must get out of here." Smith's complaint is made yet more specific when he notes in one of the film's most notorious lines, "I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I try to classify your species. I've realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively creates a natural equilibrium with its surrounding environment. But you humans don't. You move on to an area and you multiply and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. The only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There's another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what that is? A virus. Human beings are disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we're the cure." Smith's reference to the Black Morpheus and his racially diverse team as a virus, something that cannot truly live yet can sap life from those who do, reprises with dazzling brevity racist rhetorics of a so-called rising tide of color, dating at least to Lothrop Stoddard's book of that title, published in 1920. I know Laura knows what I'm talking about. There's also, of course, the fact that the process of red pilling, which Morpheus offers Neo, isn't really that different from the various methods of demystification, which I depict as inherently progressive to my students. Quote, "The Matrix is everywhere," Morpheus tells Reeves, the neophyte. "It is the wool that has been pulled over your eyes. You are a slave in a prison you cannot see. Its avatars likewise are, quote, everyone and no one. I'm sure many of us have used this language almost exactly to teach the Marxian understanding of ideology. Indeed, it's the hermeneutic driving most of my readings today. But the film's animated by another imperative that takes place beneath this more affirming one. So with that in mind, I'll offer in what follows my own red pill. To that end, let's talk about those robot overlords again. Morpheus describes artificial intelligence to Neo as, quote, a race of machines. They seem sovereign, but he assures Neo they can be defeated. Humans, after all, retain the power of, quote, adaptation and improvisation. What Morpheus calls our enemy, by contrast, quote, the system, is not smart or adaptive. He tells Neo, quote, their system is based on rules, so they'll never be as fast or as strong as you. In contrast, Neo must, quote, free his mind, which the novice evidences by, among other things, learning Kung Fu. Orientalist signifiers are themselves nothing new in cyberpunk, of course. So when Neo examines the Matrix code on a computer monitor, it looks like an Asian script. The ideal of cognition, behavior, and belief embraced by Morpheus, Neo, and Trinity incarnates here nothing short of a neoliberal Superman. A ruthlessly adaptive Ubermensch for whom knowledge and cultural data are immediate, fungible, and downloadable, who is intuitively responsive to dynamic environmental signals, an actor who navigates a plastic world liberated of boundaries and control, a man for all seasons, a man unburdened by belief or faith or tradition, a man for whom raw facticity itself, that is the red pill, is always the answer. A man for whom, as Marx the poet put it, all that is solid melts into air. Quote, the one, Neo, nominally the ever new, is therefore also the imaginary plenum of Lacanian analysis, but implicitly also the recombinant singularity, just in time flexibility made flesh. On the one hand, it is certainly part of my argument to insist that this neoliberal mythology works to promote the consolidation of whiteness, insofar as the creative destructions and mutations it enjoins remain uniquely available to those whose whiteness codes flexibly as no race at all. On the other, I think the film actually supplies a considerably more concrete account of the racial substrate implied by its neoliberal valorizations. Consider that Orientalized matrix code again. The matrix itself, recall, is intelligent, yes, but artificially so. It can't really think, can't adapt, can't grow. So it can't be too strange that the emblem or face of this primitivity would be Orientalized, given long-standing depictions of Asian culture itself as robotic and inhuman. The matrix then is not so much a race of machines as a network of racial machines. Consider the more genteel version of such beliefs at play in rhetorics around Asian American college admission quotas, concentration in STEM fields, etc. Like the AI matrix itself, Asian subjects in such narratives are deemed calculating and precise, but not creative or humanistic. Yet it must seem a bit counterintuitive that if the matrix is Orientalized in order to degrade it, the visual sign of its superior, to wit, Neo's use of Kung Fu, is also, well, Oriental. Squaring of this circle, of course, lies in the fact that Kung Fu is a signifier liberated from its racial origin to be incorporated into whiteness, cast here as a vanishing point for cultural data, and thus as a creative synthesis incarnate. So the Orientalism of Kung Fu doesn't degrade Neo's creativity, but actually instantiates it. What to do with Agent Smith's soliloquy then? According to one particularly paranoid account, its convergence with racist narratives of diversity as itself pathogenic and diseased would function as what conservatives are now so keen to call a false flag, a distraction that is thrown up by the text in order to shield and perpetrate ever more insidiously its true white supremacist narrative, one to which it bears stating explicitly here the diverse cast and characters of the resistance are fully committed. Ultimately, though, I prefer another reading. In this one, Agent Smith's racist polemic is fully of a piece with the uncreative, non-adaptive, and queerly non-reproductive intelligence of the machines he represents. His invective confirms the machine's inability to flourish in neoliberalism's limitless domains of entrepreneurship and affective labor. Consider that Smith casts humans not just as a disease, as a plague, but as a virus, that which neither lives nor dies. Such a derogation, however, betrays an insufficient awareness of the extent to which the brave world already not so new by 1999, virality in this new world not so new by 1999, virality is or might be an ideal in itself. That which neither lives nor dies, yet can make die and let live. The virus is biology's answer to the singularity, the one as plasticity, the consummate protagonist, the sovereign even, of neoliberalism's necropolitical empire. The virus is mutable, flexible, and selfish. Like the human slaves awakened by Neo, it is life, or at least unlife, without boundaries, without control. It is only fitting then that the avatar of an Orientalized race of machines that is in fact a machinic race would be insufficiently hip to these new economies of scale and life. The film's utopian whiteness to come will prosper by its convergence with virality, its incorporation of and inoculation by death, while the matrix withers, wedded as it is to an archaic promotion of vitality without end. Race, resistance, and plague are thus triangulated again, and they are still very much with us. All right, that's all I have for now. So I'd be happy to take questions, move to a discussion.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, Travis. All right, so we are now opening things up to questions from the audience. You can use the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. So I usually cheat and get to ask the first question. I feel like that's my prerogative since I'm hosting. I can ask a question. My problem today, Travis, is I have too many questions. And so one I feel like is not fair, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because now I want you to analyze all kinds of movies for me. And so I'm really I'm curious if what you would say about how um, people of Asian descent are depicted in the Blade Runner movies. But if that's not fair because you haven't seen them, then I can ask a different question. But I just was struck by um, as you were talking, I just thought, oh, there's a movie. So I should back up. As you were analyzing these films, I was thinking, wow, I don't pay attention to anything because you were pointing out all these things that were very clear once you said them, but that I had never thought of. But a movie where I really, even as just a plain audience member, not thinking intellectually about it at all, where I really watched and said, okay, the depictions of people of Asian descent in this movie are troubling and I don't know what to do with them, is Blade Runner. So, can you comment on that at all? Is there anything that you would say about that?
Yeah, I have seen the Blade Runners. I've actually seen all three cuts of Blade Runner, but we don't need to go into that. Yeah, I mean, Blade Runner is kind of a fascinating piece of this story. Um, I think the first one, I think it's released in theaters in 1982, so 2 years before William Gibson publishes Neuromancer, which is considered like kind of the first major shot across the bow of like literary cyberpunk. And the two texts are pretty similar in both. And Ridley Scott and Gibson have both explicitly talked about how, in their imagination, Japan is kind of um, it's the space of the future, right? It's the physical location of the temporal future, right? So in that way, and this is obviously a time where there's ascendant economic anxieties in the U.S. about rising, especially high tech production in East Asia. So that if we think about that early '80s moment of Neuromancer and Blade Runner, you have inaugurated the beginning of this ambivalence towards Asian signifiers, which are kind of overdetermined or multiply cathected, both as kind of sexy and alluringly futuristic, but also in that way a terrifying emblem of humanity's belatedness, which itself is an allegory about U.S. industrial competitiveness. So that trend is born there and then moves forward. I mean, certainly until the Matrix, until Blade Runner was the release is now only 2 years old. It's still a very fungible trope. I don't know if I don't remember the full question. Does that answer it?
Yeah, and wh- why do you think the trope remains so fungible? And then related to that, um, the idea of thinking, if we go back to Charlotte Perkin Perkins Gilman and the yellow wallpaper, I mean, I can't help but think about the attacks in Atlanta, and there the alleged, do we have to say alleged gunman? We know he's the gunman, but anyway, he uses this language of, well, I have a sex addiction and I was trying, right? So that again, this idea that somehow the women that he attacked are the disease or are the virus, or right. And so I'm just, what do you think keeps that trope having legs and able to be deployed over and over again?
I mean, part of what I think makes it so seductive is that Asianness occupies this alluringly liminal role in the kind of, let's say, reductively white black binarism or Manichaeanism of like racial culture in the US. So in a way, Asianness then offers a site where you can negotiate and think through racial identity without being so explicit about it, right? Because uh, it seems less obvious, right? But as I mean, as not just the case of the shootings in Atlanta, but I mean, think about these emerging rhetorics around like where did COVID come from, right? Was it a menacing Chinese lab that's kind of the emblem of like Asianness as like a terrifying emblem of techno futurism, or did it come from like a wet market, which is an emblem of like the atavistic, right? Insufficiently modern, and the return of the primitive repressed, right? So I think our desire to kind of maintain a suspension between those two originary locations speaks to like what white supremacist rhetorics need out of Asian signifiers, to not to pick one, but to maintain both as viable. Um, and then, just I'll say in passing about the shootings, we've seen kind of this media belaboring of, well, he says it was a sex addiction, not a racial thing, but the violence that emerges out of that presupposes an earlier moment in which Asian bodies are available for sexual pleasure, and therefore are the placeholder where um, a violent uh, super egoic retaliation would take place. I don't know. Again, I don't know if that fully answers your question.
No, absolutely, and actually, that I think you're so right that that there's a way for some people that they can't separate the Asianness and the sexual availability in the same way. Since I'm a 19th century U.S. historian, um, there's a quote from the late 19th, early 20th century from a Southern white man who says that in his mind he associated sex with Black women so much so that he says to encounter a Black woman as, an adolescent was to create sexual excitement for him because he just associated those two things. And I'm wondering, I think that there's some of that happening in this case as well. But I don't want to hog all the time. So if there are other questions,
Look, I'm always happy to keep rambling about Blade Runner, but yeah,
if there are other questions from our audience, we are happy to take them. So you can raise your hand or you can add them to the chat.
I see familiar faces here, as well as black squares portending familiar faces.
Oh yeah, okay, Laura Richardson.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. That was great. I haven't seen Fight Club in years, and now I'm definitely gonna have to go back and watch it again because your ideas about Fight Club in particular seem very kind of like counter experiential and like counter visual. So one of the questions that I have has to do with kind of like approach and methodology, and the kind of like really interesting like unearthing readings that you're doing, the very skeptical readings that you're doing. I love that process. But I was thinking about the fact that Will Smith was actually originally slated to play Neo in The Matrix, which would have completely, like, from my mind, would have completely changed the movie. Not just because Will Smith and Keanu Reeves are two very different actors, and their kind of affect seems very different. But because the kind of signifying, right, of actors' racial identities has on film. So one of the things that I am interested in with your talk is the way that you're interested in reading scripts as forms of like racial identification that's almost like against actors like racial identities. So could you say a little bit more? There's a question in there somewhere, but I'm kind of interested in like where's the power here, and how do you understand like these two things kind of fitting together or not fitting together, the script and then like the actor's identity?
I'd love to see like an alternative cut of Will Smith in that role. I guess to start out with, I wonder if maybe the answer that may well be kind of too clever by half is like, does your question answer itself given Will Smith's own tenuous relationship to whiteness? Like that Will Smith is at that time especially was historically understood as like the white man's black man, right? Like all the thinking about, well, his raps are clean and he's not like a gangster, right, or a thug. And so maybe the answer I want to say is like the fact that the black person they would have cast for that is Will Smith maybe answers the fact that the script and the story does wield some kind of autonomy in determining what actors can come in. I mean, in a way then, while in a way then, like at the kind of level of cultural unconscious associations, Will Smith and Keanu Reeves are both racially ambiguous, right? Will Smith's black, but like his traffic with kind of media of like kind of white comfort maybe puts him in the same place as Keanu, where like the script demands someone who floats in that liminal zone between whiteness and its resistance, right? And then so you can get either Keanu for that or Will Smith, right? So I guess to answer your question, you know, I do think obviously actors affect the meaning that can be extracted from a film. But I do, I mean, I'm like a, you know, I'm not like a, I'm not a dramatist, you know what I'm saying? Like I do ultimately put maybe a condescending limitation around the power of performance to change the let's say political imperatives of a text. Does that get close?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was interested in that, especially your reading of Brad Pitt's character. Yeah, thank you.
And the Laura's tidbit that he was in Wild Wild West instead of The Matrix is also interesting, just because I remember the furor over, can we have this black actor play this, you know, iconic white character in a way that you just thought, wow, this is all pretend. Why are you freaking out about this? Right? So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's like reminiscent or anticipatory of the real ballyhoo around rating Old Town Road on the country Billboard charts. You know, like they're this great. This was like 3 or 4 years ago at this point, but when that came out and it started to chart on country charts, there was a really ineffable resistance to that. Or Bridgerton, yeah, exactly. So I mean, yeah, Wild Wild West. I mean, what's interesting is he left so he could have done a cyberpunk film and he did a steampunk film instead.
Great. Are there any other questions for Dr. Alexander? Oh, let's see. There's the series Orange is the New Black, talks about some important things from Lorena Bomfin. And then, Molly Kiles, go right ahead.
Hi.
Let me just say quickly, I haven't seen Orange is the New Black, so I am going to have to like plead out ignorance on that one.
I just started watching Orange is the New Black. It's very good, so I can speak that that's good. But my question I was going to ask about, and I don't know if I was in the class last semester, I'm not sure if we did discuss this, but in the discussion about the Matrix and about the agent using like smell as like a disgust towards humans, that reminded me of Parasite and like the motif of like smell being like the biggest class distinction between like the rich and the poor classes. And I just was wondering if you wanted to speak on that.
I don't know if I have anything too articulate to say on that. I mean, I buy it instinctively. You know, Freud says smell is the sense we're most afraid of. It is a kind of you know, and I mean, obviously smell has an empirical power more than some of the other senses to transport you and like kind of defamiliarize your circumstances, to rip you out of a kind of spatiotemporal continuum. You know, when you like smell like a perfume or something that brings, you know, you're back to like someone who wore it like 15 years ago. There's a woman on my block who wears a perfume that was worn by some teacher I had in like 2nd or 3rd grade, and I don't even know what it's called, but it's like a really powerful whenever I walk by. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about the the Parasite comparison is just, you know, that it provides a kind of controlled variable that shows that the power, like olfactory power, transcends national traditions, right? That even in a Korean film, like, you know, that they're kind of equally poignant. Do you want to answer the question about Orange is the New Black since you've seen it?
I'm only on like season 1, so I'm not completely qualified. But it's a very interesting show. I'll give you that.
Too much TV, not enough time.
Anyone? I think we have time for one last question if anyone wants to ask it before I let everyone go. Anyone? All right, then. Thank you to Dr. Travis Alexander for such a stimulating discussion today and a wonderful presentation. I'm telling you, I'm going to be watching everything with different kind of eyes, all of my shows. So thank you so much for giving us a lot of food for thought. I want to reiterate again, if you're interested in learning more or getting more of Dr. Alexander, he is teaching a summer school class. So you are welcome to check that out, check out the schedule. Can you remind us of which session you're teaching in and what the schedule is?
Yeah, I'm teaching a class called Mental Health in Literature, Film, and Social Media. And that's going to be in session B2, which starts on like June 30th. And it's going to be all on Zoom, and it meets Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays in the evening. We don't meet till like 7, so you could even hold down a job if you wanted.
All right, thanks for that information. And again, thank you to all of our audience members for joining us. We appreciate your time today, and be on the lookout for more Humanities Now conversations next academic year. Hope everybody's having a good end of the semester. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.